Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Voice of the Listener and Viewer event. This is the Jocelyn Hay Lecture. It's actually the 5th Jocelyn Hay Lecture which we've had. We established these lectures to commemorate Jocelyn Hay, who was the founder of the VLV nearly 40 years ago now, and who was a brilliant fighter on behalf of the citizens in the UK for quality, excellence in public service broadcasting. We've established these lectures to give the opportunity for eminent people in this field to give us their views about the future of broadcasting, the future of public service broadcasting in particular. Now, we're delighted that Claire Enders has agreed to give the lecture this year. Claire will be known to many of you. She, after a distinguished career as a media strategy executive, she founded the Enders Consultancy in 1997. It is now one of the preeminent, I would say actually it is the preeminent consultancy, media consultancy in the United Kingdom at the moment. So welcome to Claire. Now, just a couple of bits of housekeeping first. If you want to ask a question, and we really hope you will ask a question, we would encourage you, as many of you as possible, to do so. You will see a chat window to the right of the video player. If you're logged into a Vimeo account, you can simply post a question. Please put your name in the box first. If you're not logged in, you just need to enter your name in the boxes on the screen and accept Vimeo's terms and conditions before selecting Join. You can then type your question, once again with your name, and click the send button. I will take as many questions as time permits. So now let me hand over to Claire. Claire, it's a real pleasure and an honor for us that you're doing this. Claire.
Thank you so much, Colin. Can I have the first slide, please? So the purpose of my talk this evening is really to bring you up to date with a whole lot of information, viewing trends, but also political developments, and to seek your support on the overall views that I'm expounding in order to support public service broadcasting, not only for the next few years, but really for 10 years or 20 years beyond the existing framework. And the reason for looking that far away and looking beyond sustainability really this evening is because public service broadcasting remains so important to so many. So on this chart, you can see that there's really a very, very clear generational divide. People under the age of 40 have spent the last decade sliding away from public service broadcasting towards other options. They've included Sky for at least a generation, but also YouTube, Netflix, where in January we will be celebrating the Netflix decade, 10 years of Netflix, and then other players, Amazon Prime and Disney Plus, which launched last year. So we've seen this country take up more choices that are available than almost any other nation on the planet Earth. But we've also seen public service broadcasting in particular really retain its strength of purpose and its mission. And over half the population is still absolutely reliant on public service broadcasting. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that there was actually quite a bump in 2020, a bump up, and that was because of the pandemic, possibly other factors as well, but certainly as our lives has changed, public service broadcasting was basically at the center of how people could see this new paradigm, both the paradigm of the virus and the pandemic, but also the paradigms of the evolution of our country. So it's plain to me that if the 45 plus are still really very reliant on public service broadcasting, and despite this extraordinary addition of choices that has occurred in this country, that will be the case for many, many years to come. And what I'm going to ask for your support this evening is for the means in which the core provision of public service broadcasting can not only be delivered and continue to be delivered, but can be strengthened and taken away from a certain downward trend. Can you turn the slide, please? So at the beginning of 2020, before the pandemic struck, the government that had just been elected, our government, seemed to propound a view that was so radical that really Colin and I felt that we were facing an existential crisis, and I think many others who had sustained and supported public service broadcasting over decades like us felt absolutely terrified and a terrible sense of disquiet. In fact, the answer that seemed to emanate from number 10 to most problems of policy or most ideas about how broadcasting could flourish or how our creative ecology could flourish seemed to be answered by the words, "Let them eat Netflix," which is hardly what we wanted to hear. And it was absolutely terrifying because it showed an extraordinary ignorance of really the viewing habits and lives of so many people in this country. And when we go further, you'll see that essentially subscription video on demand is a wonderful choice. We've seen massive development of it. We have extraordinary choices that are put in front of the British public every day in that area, but they are not enough. And therefore, the "let them eat Netflix" answer to the future is the wrong one. And we very fortunately have seen a significant evolution in the government's thinking, significant evolution towards pathways that will sustain what is, after all, the most important viewing choice for the population as a whole. 95% of the population watches every month. And so we will see that going forward. And we have seen huge progress, not least because the government has announced a white paper which will lead to legislation. Can I have the next slide? So the reason why it is most important to think about the financial underpinning of public service broadcasting in this country, something that my firm has thought about for a generation, and that is for longer actually, but professionally at least for a generation, and that is because in this time, the Goliath that was the BBC has become a tiny little pipsqueak. So perhaps from number 10's perspective, or from the perspective of a newspaper office, the BBC, with its vast income, continues to be a giant dinosaur, Tyrannosaurus Rex, terrifying people engaged in very, very valiant attempts to make money out of their websites. But actually, as time has moved on, we can see that the global scale and consolidation efforts, primarily of American companies, have yielded extraordinary resources that are being brought to bear on global models. So on this chart in red, or pink, actually more scarlet, you can see the combined expenditure, including on news and sport, of the UK PSBs altogether. I know you're going to say, Claire, maybe they should all merge. Okay, that's a possibility, but let's get there slowly. If you look at all the blue lines, these are the P&L expenditures. So you'll perhaps be familiar with the fact that Netflix routinely announces content budgets that are above $15 billion, and that looks like well below. These are P&L numbers. What cash is actually spent is far greater than these sums. So every year, these organizations are bringing to bear resources that are unimaginably greater than the PSBs. So that has been the case for a long time. It has really speeded up as a process in the last 10 years because of the move towards streaming and the fact that all the companies that are publicly quoted, such as Disney, Comcast, Warner Brothers, Discovery, Netflix, and so on, have seen that their streaming efforts have been the primary driver of their share prices and of their ability to tap the American capital markets. So could I have the next slide, please? Now, this slide is really interesting, and I want you to pay a great deal of close attention to this wonderful slide, because what it shows is that for every group of the population, you have got a really significant element of time that is still going to public service broadcasting. And I'm talking about kids. So you can see that the BBC and commercial PSBs, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, and the non-PSB broadcasters, the chief among them being UK TV, well, that compendium is still a significant part of even kids viewing. But when you look at older demographics, and I'm pointing you yet again to the generational divide, which seems to exist around the age of 40, and that generational divide, which is basically 50% of the viewing population, sits on one side of that and 50% on the other. But still, in that younger demographic, if you look at particularly the combination of the lower ranks, plus thinking to yourself that about a third of that blue line, the non-PSB broadcaster, is actually some kind of PSB material coming back to people that way, you're looking at an extraordinary success by British public service broadcasters in addressing the needs of the British public and in getting around the terrifying sums that are being spent on drama and innovating and also offering range, breadth, voices, different parts of our country well represented, news, current affairs, all kinds of programming go into what is the day. I mean, it may well be that we can only remember really significant series that come past the bows and so on. But actually every day people are watching such a range of material, soap operas, daytime material, and so on. And also completely unconfined to the traditional choices, because most everyone in this country, all but 15% of this country, and those people who do not have television sets, are hooked up to some kind of subscription service. So people have a huge amount of choice. In this country also, we have a very high penetration of PCs, of broadband. And so YouTube, which is a huge and significant choice for many people, is also a huge and significant choice, as you can see from the online video line, which is the one at the top. YouTube is the primary choice in this area, but you can see that even older people are perfectly capable of finding it and using it if they so wish. There is nothing about our environment that forces anyone to watch anything they don't want to watch. If anything, it's more the opposite. It's how to control viewing of material that is inappropriate, that has occupied parents, regulators, and schools for the better part of a generation, and which Ofcom is starting to tackle now. But still, you can see that our country, with these age divides visible, is still really engaged with PSB content. And why is that? In the last year, we've come up with a number of interesting ideas as to how to explain that to politicians who say, let them eat Netflix. Well, it's because this material is strongly differentiated, and because it has this Britishness, it has these values. Public service broadcasting regulation has created a style of creation which is now known the world over, and it wouldn't have become known without the support that public service broadcasting has had in this country over many generations. Could you turn the slide? So looking at the group of people who do not subscribe at all, those people are also a very polarized group. As you can see, 3.9 million of those adults, about half the adults are ABC1, so a wealthy demographic, and the other half are C2D, the relatively poor people. And also in this group of relatively poor people will fall people who are disabled, people who live alone, people who are very elderly, as you can see. In terms of the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that adults that are 55 to 74 represent a good chunk of this group, and then the over 75s, another significant group, which is one of the reasons why my company fought so hard to protect the right of poor and disabled households to have a free license fee, because these people are really reliant on these media. And that's before, I mean, we're just looking at television, that's before we look at radio consumption in this group. So the voice of the listener and the viewer is there also to fight for the rights and for the interests of those who do not do that themselves. And the older population is one which is so extraordinarily reliant on public service broadcasting, and because it fits their values and their ideas of themselves. So if you look at the next slide, please, you'll see that this group of people, these 8 million people who do not subscribe to any services, who are entirely reliant on Freeview and FreeSat, that group of people are extraordinarily heavy viewers. So they're watching almost 2 hours a day, more television than the average adult. So these are people who may well spend a great deal of time at home, even more so with a pandemic than they ever have before. So these interests of these people are most supported by very, very high quality public service broadcasting. But as I hope that you understand from looking at the other data, high quality public service broadcasting is of interest to every single person in this country, no matter what their age is. And there is no cutoff point, except possibly when you get elected to Parliament and you get so busy you cannot actually watch any television in the evening. Can I have the next slide, please? So this comes to the great elephant in the room issue. So the BBC has struggled over the last decade, and it has struggled in the face of a real difficulty, perhaps its own difficulty in explaining its missions and objectives and its financial structure to those who are in a position to decide on its future. On 2 occasions, in 2010 and particularly in 2015, the BBC's finances were reshaped in a negative way, in 2015 in particular, by the imposition of the over 75s and a host of other measures, including taking up the full cost of S4C, a number of other measures which have weighed systematically on the books of an organization which is already so old that it has many pensioners and a very significant pension fund deficit that must be funded every year. There is no way that this organization can continue to meet the extraordinary levels of demand upon it, not just the radio services, the global services, but also and above all, the ability to compete in the UK and above all in the TV business. Because although we have seen fluctuating fortunes in terms of the actual inflation number, and we're now staring at an extraordinary level predicted to be 7% in April. But the production sector itself has its own special inflation, and it's been running at about 10% in terms of high-end drama for a very good long time, as a result of which the BBC needs to have a settlement this time that has got a correct inflation settlement baked in. Now, the reason why it is so important to get the early stage right is because of the cumulative negative nature of getting it wrong. The BBC settlement is a 6-year settlement, and the CPI that will apply in 23, 24, 25, all of these numbers are specified by the Treasury, and they remain in the balance. So it is the most important time. I bless the government for its constructive approach to these discussions, and I am glad that they have not concluded yet, because it means that the government is reviewing the inflation number that it will bake into the settlement, and that settlement will have untold effect, more effect than any other single measure on the quality of choices that are available in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, let alone in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, or 20 years' time. That is why the BBC license fee settlement is of paramount importance. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is going to remind you and refresh your minds about the fact that the BBC spends most of the money that is given to it actually supporting the creation and production of fantastic quality material that is consumed every day and in very, very far-flung places, as much as in far-flung parts of this country. And as you can see, the elements that are of softest element of all is the TV number, which is 1.4 billion. That is the area that the BBC has traditionally shaved off because most of the other requirements upon it cannot be altered. They are bedrock BBC. So when the BBC can no longer compete in terms of high-end drama, that will be a time of great sadness for those people who are reliant on the BBC for those choices and who are expecting the BBC, particularly those people who are paying the license fee and used to get it free, who are expecting the BBC to be a great value proposition, which, as I hope you can see, it definitely is. Can I have the next slide? So we have calculated that the BBC is going to be affected to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds. And as a result of this cumulative effect, as I say, is so important to understand that we hope that the government will pay attention to the range of options that are possible in baking a license fee settlement that also allows the BBC to participate in a number of policy areas that are of extraordinary importance, not only to the government's desire to level up the North, but also to our collective desire to see the creative economy and its values, its employment profiles, its industries, to see those actually take off even more outside of the M25. The BBC is the greatest force that will bring this to bear. Can I have the next slide? Coming on to the most interesting topic of all, Channel 4 and the privatization of Channel 4. This is something that the government feels very, very deeply about. It's an ideological change to no longer wish to own a public service broadcaster of this type. But it also presents opportunities, not only for Channel 4, but also for us as viewers. So the government has come a very long way from the path that it had set itself on 10 years ago when it first wished to privatize Channel 4, let alone in 2015 when it was well set on it. And even more recently, the government has gone very, very far towards full understanding of Channel 4's missions, objectives, vocations, of its remit, of its economic impact. So we're really seeing a government, and I'm quoting only from John Whittingdale, who after all has led a campaign of a generation to privatize Channel 4, in mentioning that the government was going to strengthen the remit of Channel 4, was going to define it. And I think that this speaks to me very greatly that there is no desire now to jettison Channel 4 as this beautiful, creative entity, which gives so many interesting choices to people, particularly groups that over the last 40 years have found new levels of representation, or representation for the first time. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see that Channel 4 has really found its audience in the UK, and the government has come to recognize that privatizing an entity that is so valuable as it is, quirky, interesting, innovative, and different, that this is going to work possibly also commercially. And you could see that Channel 4, in a certain way, is sort of the epitome of public service broadcasting at its best. You know, you look at some of these statements that Channel 4 is hitting way above the next highest PSB channel, or the average at the bottom of all the other PSB channels, which is not very high, I have to say, but you can see that there's demonstrable engagement in terms of percentage of people who are going to agree with statements like challenges prejudices, makes me consider things in new, different ways, tackles issues other channels wouldn't. So, moving to the next slide, what I would like the government to do is to keep to its word, as John Whittingdale said, to strengthen the remit of Channel 4 so that it will continue and even do more, be even more ambitious in its missions, which are actually quite specified, As you can see, this chart is very complex, but you can see that Channel 4 is required, amongst others, to engage in a certain number of creation of regional hours, regional production spend. These are very important elements of Channel 4's strategy to move its operations outside of London, to engage in much greater production outside of London. And the GVA that results from this extraordinary effort to basically take itself out of London over the last 5 years is remarkable, and EY estimated it in 2019 at around 300 million a year outside of London. So it's a huge contribution. Channel 4, there's no question that Channel 4 is sustainable. Channel 4 has been viable and sustainable for most of its history, with the odd little hiccup. And so we have no doubt that Channel 4 is sustainable. That's not the purpose of privatization. For us, the purpose of privatization would be to strengthen the remit and to place Channel 4 into the embrace of an organization with global scale, with global technology assets, with global production assets, and with access to global capital markets. That would strike us as a significant improvement, but only after legislation has materially quantified and defined the requirements on a buyer. And also, we find it extraordinarily important for there to be no auction to the highest bidder. A company that is prepared to shoulder this extraordinary mission of Channel 4 is not a company that is going to write a giant check and then sack most of the people. That would not be an outcome that would be assistive to anyone, least of all the creative economy of the UK, the independent producers, and all of the other stakeholders in Channel 4. Can we have the next slide? Ofcom, meanwhile, announced the results of its public service media review, and it has come up with an excellent blueprint, which we need. We need this blueprint because the last major piece of legislation in our sector was in 2003, and what Ofcom is proposing and what the DCMS is going to champion is a set of measures around prominence in particular, but also a meshing together of the online and broadcast spaces, which is going to be greatly assistive for all the players and stakeholders in public service broadcasting. The separate piece of legislation that will privatize Channel 4, should it come about, is going to be one that extends the commercial PSB licenses for 10 years, which will happen anyway in the course of the next 2 years, but it will do so with a framework which has been accepted by the entire industry, is one which is going to be a safe and wonderful structure for all the ambitions, in particular around the quality and indeed the Britishness and the value to the public service value of the media that people are actually paying for. So these are momentous times. We're looking at a license fee settlement, which will come through any moment now, legislation which is going to be worked on all the way through to its slot in 2022, the renewal of the PSB licenses, the potential privatization of Channel 4. It is not necessary for Channel 4 to be privatized, but if Channel 4 is privatized, then let that be a great opportunity to make Channel 4 into a global player. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much indeed. That's excellent. Lots of stuff to get stuck into there. I'm happy to say the questions are beginning to come in quite rapidly. A couple of my own to start with, if I may. I mean, I guess looking at the challenges facing public service broadcasting, in particular the BBC, they're competitive, they're commercial, they're political. Which of these do you think is the single biggest challenge?
So the single biggest challenge facing the BBC is inflation. You know, everything else is noise. The production sector, you cannot find quality talent from here to the Orkneys. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, we hear a lot about productions being launched by Netflix and Amazon, and there's a lot of weight on the production sector. But actually, the total amount spent by the streamers in 2020 was around the same as Channel 4 on origination. So that's how much all the streamers, but that is a considerable weight on. They've certainly driven up an awful lot of the costs. So I'd say that 10% inflation in all of the elements of high quality drama is a very, very frightening situation for the BBC, because as you saw from the chart, the BBC spends on a myriad of services that no one can remember, but which are really heavily used and of huge value to people. But the MPs, you know, the politicians, they can only think about a couple of major drama series. And of course, it's always let them eat Netflix because of the sheer comparison. I mean, the forces of Netflix, you know, spending 15, 16, 17 billion dollars a year on content compared to the BBC. So I think inflation is the number one issue for the BBC, and also because, you know, it will affect their employees, it will affect their pension payments. I mean, a host of downstream very, very negative elements. And of course, you know, we're cognizant of the fact that inflation in the license fee would affect the lives of people who are paying it for the first time. And I'm sure the BBC is extraordinarily careful about how it spends money, precisely because it has so many stakeholders, and many of them are you know, face real sacrifice to pay that license fee.
You sounded actually quite optimistic in your lecture about the change of approach in government, or government, you think, recognizing the importance of PSB, perhaps in a way that it didn't a while ago. I mean, that's only, as far as the BBC is concerned, that only really matters if that is translated into action. And in the case of the BBC, it's, as you've said, it's to do with the funding settlement. I mean, what is your best assessment of what's going to happen in that funding settlement? Has the message been strong enough to actually persuade the government that, yeah, the BBC needs some more money?
Well, I think the government is certainly aware of the inflation numbers, and we're looking at almost emergency level action now being taken on a number of different fronts, because the inflation rise has been so sudden and so across the board. So in some ways, the BBC has benefited from a slow approach to the settlement, precisely because this is allowing the government to really take in the magnitude of this amount. I mean, ideologically, this government is not in favor of giving more resource to the BBC, and ideologically, it is in favor of the market answering the needs of customers and consumers wherever necessary and wherever possible, which we're all in favor of. And as we can see, the UK is not missing any of that. We are blessed. But I think that, especially after spending 35 years as an analyst in this space, I think we can see that there's no choice that has ever wiped out the need to have British British stories, a British identity conveyed. And as an immigrant, I'm anxious about these things, but I myself have constantly put forward the notion of our distinctive creative economy, of our distinctive creative sovereignty, of our Britishness. I say this, I'm domiciled in Scotland, so I'm very sensitive to Britishness, how it's conveyed. So I think all of this is something that the government has started to really fully understand the value of. And of course, the impact of I think Channel 4's early moves out of London and the BBC's ambition. Tim Davie has been very ambitious. I think that is persuading the government that the BBC has a very significant role to play, a very different role to play, more of the same, really. And I think the appointment of the new chair, Richard Sharp, shows, very sensible, safe pair of hands, very familiar with this massive financial conundrum that is the BBC. But the government has to believe that these universally acceptable and accessible choices, because that again is what public service broadcasting is. It's not going to be over violent. It's not going to horrify you. It's not going to shock you. It might shock you a little bit. that this is a cultural thing that is us, is something that I think the government has really deeply come to recognize. And I've seen that drift particularly in the Channel 4 privatization debate, where the government has really taken on board a lot of these very, very interesting, very complex requirements that Channel 4 has, and as really views them as very important. The Paralympics, the news, none of this is up for grabs. It's all going to be baked in. I think the government has moved a very, very long way towards understanding the economic and cultural and social role of broadcasting.
If they've moved a very long way in the case of Channel 4, they've moved pretty quickly, because when the recent consultation was announced, it was very much on the basis that Channel 4 wasn't going to be sustainable. But they produced no evidence to support that. And as you've said this evening, Channel 4 would still be sustainable. And when we at the VLV questioned John Whittingdale on this at a fairly early stage of the debate, there was no talk of strengthening the the remit, and he was actually reluctant to actually confirm that the remit would be kept in place. So it does seem to have been a rather rapid conversion, and therefore, can it be reliable?
Well, I think there's another way of looking at it. If Channel 4 were not sustainable, the government would have no success in selling it, would it? Because
it might if the remit was changed.
It would if the remit was changed, maybe. But you see, it's the very fact that Channel 4 is sustainable with its remit, with its management, with its modus operandi. But the question, I think the government has moved a very long way, and we must congratulate them on that. And I think we'll see how Ofcom and the DCMS develop the legislation. But I, for one, and many others will be fighting for the government to put their money where their mouth is and codify that remit and specify it for a future buyer. And I haven't found, I have to say, I haven't found buyers that are running a mile away from the remit or from the culture of Channel 4, from its ethos, from its identity. No, I mean, the Channel 4 is a global success and one of the most interesting innovations that the UK has ever come up with. So really, I think that it's just that the government started out with this idea that it was unsustainable 5 or 6 years ago, and it sort of kept going with that, and it's found it hard to give it up, or in fact, even confess that it was wrong in the first place, even to start down this route, and that actually ideologically does not wish to own this broadcaster. And as you know, Colin, because we've discussed it, I, for one, can see some real upside in Channel 4 having the editorial independence that, to my mind, is always compromised by its ownership by the government. And we've seen the government intervene in the stewardship of the BBC and of Channel 4 in a way that would be completely unheard of if that company were ITV or STV or Channel 5 indeed. So I think there are benefits that people are not taking on board. And above all, of course, the benefit, as I see it, of Channel 4 having another 10-year license and prominence and all of this framework of rights and potentiality around its future, that for me is the quickest way to make Channel 4 much more sustainable, is a piece of new broadcast legislation that will make sure that viewers can very easily find Channel 4 on every device, and that Channel 4 is not going to be blocked from prominence on the connected TV sets or indeed the Sky Glass that will be sold in very large numbers for years to come.
And prominence, of course, is entirely within the ability of the government to deliver. So it's going to be a key thing for the media bill. Just back in the BBC for a second, universality you mentioned is important. We at the VLV think universality is vital. Universality, of course, is completely opposite from any sense of a subscription service. Do you think this set of, the threat of subscription, not now, obviously, but at the time of the next charter review, do you think that threat or possibility is still there?
Yes, I do. I think that it will always be one of the government's chief sticks to beat the BBC with, will be decriminalisation or voluntary, the whole issue of a voluntary nature to the licence fee. These are very connected issues. But I also think that the government has laid those issues to rest for now, and that I'm very glad of that. I think we will see what the Charter brings, but every time the Charter renewal process has come around, these issues have been on the table. And in a democracy, it's probably a very good idea to reaffirm these core principles that we're all sharing in this universal public good called the BBC. And indeed, because we share in it, the world shares in it. And as I said, if you look at the way people vote with their feet, and may I just point out to any government officials who are watching, is that the group of people who are most devoted to public service broadcasting are in fact the voters. They're the people who vote all the time. So don't tamper with a system that works so well for people in this country just because you spend your evenings voting in Parliament and don't have any time for it. Yes, well, we just have to hope for the best, but I'm sure those issues will be around forever. In fact, in some ways, some of these issues have been around forever anyway, so for 40 years, but they've sort of become baked into the DNA of the whole debate around public service broadcasting, around the culture wars, around what the BBC should do. And as Tim Davies said in an excellent interview at the weekend, I think he's just doing the best he can and dealing with one issue at a time. And it's impossible for the BBC in particular, with so much space to put out news, radio news, global services, the online services, the website, everything. There's just a huge amount of space to upset someone in government or whatever. But that's good too. That's good too. I mean, I hope the government welcomes debate, welcomes provocations again one day.
Going to questions from the audience, Bob Usherwood, who's a VLV member, said, I think slightly tongue-in-cheek, do you see the appointment of the new Culture Secretary as part of the government's, quotes, constructive approach to the BBC and PSB values? One might doubt that from some of the things that she has said in the past.
Yes, but, Nadine Dorries is a woman who's become minister, and when you're the minister, you're the steward and the custodian of institutions, of a department. And I think that we'll judge this new minister by her actions. And so far, I think she's been not particularly provocative or controversial. I think she's been going in the same movement of dealing with the BBC licence fee settlement, of continuing with the privatization of Channel 4. I mean, we wouldn't expect her to materially change that directionality, and I don't think she has. My mind is completely open, as it is on Ms. Lopez, and I wish them a great deal of luck, because this is a wonderful sector, and actually unusually, it's probably the only set of sectors where good news comes from time to time. Oscars get won, and pride is manifested in our country. So it's a wonderful sector for her, and of course she is a creative herself. Yeah. So I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
Well, let's all hope you're right. Ben Fenton asks, Claire, could you please outline the findings of the research that your company did on the Britishness of PSB productions, as opposed to the SVOD services not based in the UK?
Yes, well, I mean, it's very delicate, but it was an analysis done by one of my colleagues, which I will send out after this thing, which I can't quite remember, but it did mention, which was my intuition, which is why I'd asked them to do the research and to keep track of this, that there was quite a distinctive style in public service broadcasting, and very, very distinctive from that on Netflix, and that actually, I mean, even though Netflix and Amazon have been tremendously good at pushing to the fore very strong, very, very high quality British productions. I mean, The Crown is a very good case in point, but there are others. The fact is, this is a drop in the ocean I mean, most of Netflix's material has cultural antecedents elsewhere. I mean, I don't have anything against them. I was a particular fan of Lupin myself, but but there's no question that the idea that any SVOD services, they themselves would never wish to replace public service broadcasting. That's one. Secondly, they are, in fact, you mentioned the word subscription. They're on subscription. You have to subscribe. They're not universally accessible. They do not have and do not wish to have the roles that news and current affairs have in portraying our country. They do not wish to have public service broadcasting obligations at all. And I think actually, I'll say it even more strongly, that I think that if it weren't for the Britishness of this extraordinary output, which, as I said, our country, really has the great benefit of punching above its weight, not just here but globally. But I think if that very Britishness were compromised, people would flee. And in fact, one of the things I want to point out for those people who are constantly thinking that if Channel 4 is privatized, it will lose, all of its remit or all of its desire to make programs outside of the M25 or will not wish to make difficult programs. Well, actually, that's belied by the experience of Channel 5, which makes many, many of its programs outside. And in fact, the search for non-London voices and stories. So it's much broader, Ben, than Britishness. It's distinctiveness that is actually helping public service broadcasting confront the streamers who have got one, I'm not going to summarize their kit, but it is a very large check. A very large checkbook. That's the kit, and they do wonderful things with it. But that's not going to be a large checkbook. Is not the future for public service broadcasting in this country. No, they have to innovate, and they have to keep innovating and keep being very clever.
I think it was about halfway through your presentation that I noticed a comment coming in from Peter Blackman saying, and then of course there's always radio. It's easy to overlook the importance of radio in this debate, and as you know, the VLV was originally just the voice of a listener before we added viewers. Can you say a bit more about how you see radio fitting into this debate?
Well, one of the wonderful aspects about radio is that it's actually very inexpensive, and it's very heavily consumed, and it has a very large number of purposes, particularly news, weather, travel, and so on. But also, there's huge amounts of talk radio in this country, music services, and so on and so forth. What we've really seen is that the government doesn't find radio controversial, right? So it did for a bit. People were not going on the Today Show, but that was more part of the anti-BBC mantra. And then, of course, when the pandemic arose, that was rapidly abandoned. So we've not seen any real animus against radio, dare I say it, since James Purnell, left his post, and we see this very calm. For some reason, I guess the people who are constantly keeping track of all of the terrible things that public service broadcasters come up with for the news and so on just can't pay attention to the radio because there's just so much of it. But it's something that has really had a renaissance, of course, as a medium, because of the renewed interest in driving in this country. So numbers remain strong. And of course, when it comes to the BBC, radio has not been immune from the cost-cutting measures. But I have to say that, I certainly I've never had the impression that the BBC would materially impact on its radio services, and the years when that was in debate seem to have disappeared. Luckily.
Back to Channel 4, if I may, from Martin Pipe. He's asking, I wonder what will happen to Channel 4's excellent news programmes, which aren't unknown to be inconvenient for the government.
Well, again, you see, that's a very interesting question. I don't think anything is going to happen to those news programs because I'm sure they're going to be baked into the requirements placed upon a buyer. And also because a commercial buyer may well be interested in those. After all, Channel 5 is currently planning to create an hour-long program, news program. So, commercial broadcasters do things that that may appear that they're public service broadcasting, but they're actually doing it because the audience kind of wants them. But Sky itself, Sky Arts is really the very definition, to my mind, of public service broadcasting, as is Sky News. Sky News is a money-losing operation, which Sky runs with great aplomb. So this division between the commercial sector on news, I think, is something that might actually favor Channel 4, because it would find again the editorial independence that to my mind it once had. I can't really quite remember when it lost it, but I have this sensation that these intimidation by the government is not something that I would wish on any business in the media.
Just once again, still on Channel 4, the question from Sophie Chalk is, if it's privatised, some way or another it'll have to pay dividends to shareholders, whether through its parent company or whatever. And won't that inevitably mean a decline in the amount of money that can be used for content for viewers?
Not at all. So we've done a number of analyses of this, and we believe that all of the negative impacts that are constantly trotted out in terms of small companies and so on, all of these can be palliated by measures that are explicit. Measures, for instance, for the new entity to continue to trade with a certain number of entities, terms of trade for companies trading under 10 million, geographic distribution, all of these things. So how can this be paid for? It's very simple. If you put, speak to Mark Thompson about this, even in 2003, 2004, putting Channel 5 and Channel 4 together, that yielded around, then it was around 100 million a year, we think, of savings, and that would be reinvested in content, could be reinvested in other things. Today, that sum would be considerably greater. So we think that certainly all of the scenarios that we've seen, the combination itself will gain so many benefits from that combination that there is very likely to be a net benefit. And in fact, empirically, may I point out that both Channel 5, since it was bought by Viacom, and Sky, since it was bought by Comcast, have very substantially increased their investment in origination. I mean, Sky, obviously, stratospherically by building these new production facilities, but also by increasing its budget from a Channel 4 size budget to $1 billion a year of new material. And Channel 5 does the same thing. So I'm always very anxious about these statements that seem to believe, but that we're like in some kind of zero-sum game, and that they're going to be negatives. Actually, so far, consolidation with USA giants has been additive to the UK's creative ecology, and substantially so. And I think that the opportunity that I sketched out, which is for Channel 4 to make programs, to become a powerhouse like ITV Studios became. I mean, ITV Studios absorbed billions of dollars of investment. So is Sky. That's how I see Channel 4's greater ambition. It's beyond sustainability and viability as a major global studio, and that will take billions. So no, I mean, a new owner of Channel 4 will be looking at how to leverage Channel 4's ability to commission for itself into new partnerships, into AVOD strategies for the UK, and international SVOD and AVOD strategies for another owner. You could say, well, Channel 4 can do this all by itself. Yes, it can. But we've seen that these entities, UK entities, Sky and Channel 5, have moved into these very large consolidated companies, and they've benefited. And so, I think it's impossible for me to do anything but to say, let us not prejudge this. Let us tie the buyer up in string so that there can be no budge, and then we will see. I am sure that we will see massive investment in the UK creative ecology behind the privatization of Channel 4. I'm absolutely certain of it.
Old Bert, John Burt asks, Claire, what roughly is the ratio of average time per person spent viewing and listening to all BBC services to average time spent viewing Netflix?
Well, it depends on the person. It's very hard to generalize that. And I don't think it's a really important measure either. What matters is that public service broadcasting is important to everybody. Certainly, the amount of time spent watching Netflix in the younger demographics would cause very significant concern, and this generational divide is something that is of primary concern. You know, why is it that young audiences are so averse to watching the news, for instance? I mean, there's been that is a much more probably the most significant drop in public service broadcasting interest has been in the news services, which are just largely unwatched by the young. So that's of concern. But no, I have to say, I think that if you looked at it, I mean, John, you will probably remember a long time ago when pay TV was coming to this country, all of us lived in fear of these giant budgets because we said there's a complete correlation between how much you spend on the screen and the viewing you get. But actually, now that we see these sort of Netflixes and Disney Pluses cycling through the market, actually that's just not true anymore. The budgetary imbalance between public service broadcasters here and SVODs is not as material.
Andrew,
anyway,
sorry.
My team will get back to you with an answer to your question.
Yeah, I'm sure John will look forward to that.
I'm sure you will.
Andrew Toysey, VLV member, asks, what tricks are the friends of the BBC and other PSB services missing in arguing the case? Are we oversimplistic, for example, in the way that we argue it and not get over some of the more sophisticated arguments?
No, I think it's a very complex picture, and that anyone who argues ad hominem and from their own, their teenagers or their young kids or their school gates experiences, usually males who go to work and who don't really understand, that ad hominem type of argumentation is very difficult to get through. But in the end, we're looking at an extraordinary success story, a creative ecology that has grown at double digits for almost a generation, export success. The DCMS in the end looks and pays attention to those things. And no, I think there was an ideological eruption. There are ideological eruptions around elections, around the major issues of Brexit. Those ideological eruptions take a long time to make their way through, and they affect how politicians see the media, and how they wish to see them going forward. I myself am ideologically in favor of very high quality public goods, whether that's education, roads, health, or indeed broadcasting. There are some in government who do not view broadcasting as the public good that I see it. But then, of course, perhaps they should understand more about how this country lives, and also about the importance of having a culture that we can all be proud of and that we can identify with and identify. I think those are arguments that the government has spent a generation wrestling with, and that we're very quick. I mean, I say this as an ex-American. This country is very quick to say, America is going to solve all of my problems and any American service will do, without really understanding that, really to John Burt's point, the real overlap area, as anyone will tell you, is drama, high quality drama. And the SVODs really serve up a lot of high quality drama, but my heavens, if all we were doing in this country is watching wall-to-wall drama, we would cease to be educated, subtle, poetic, and innovative people very, very quickly, very, very quickly.
Somebody called Colin, I don't have a second name, but it's not me, but Colin says or asks, how do the PSBs correct the generational divide and attract younger viewers? How do PSBs demonstrate the value they provide to that audience base and therefore protect their long-term future?
That's an extraordinarily good question, and I'm sure that if I had the answer to it, I could sell it for millions of pounds to any one of the PSBs. So yes, this is I think, a fundamental issue. I think it's been very difficult for the PSBs to compete against YouTube in particular, and then when Netflix started 10 years ago, even harder. I mean, it's been very hard. Unregulated media are of great attraction to young viewers. They have novelty baked in, often extraordinarily racy, very high levels of violence. HBO was extraordinarily attractive to younger demographics for at least a good 15, 20 years, particularly with Game of Thrones. And so, you know, the idea of constantly trying to make youth programming hasn't worked. But I have to say that, you know, the broadcasters who are tasked to do this, Channel 4 in particular, and Channel 5 to a lesser degree, but these broadcasters have been attracting younger viewers. It's the right program that will attract the younger viewer. No one is going to watch a channel anymore. So whether you can wedge a piece of news in the middle of Love Island or something like that, I don't know. But I think we have always noted that there is a lack of interest in news and current affairs in the young, but it has become catastrophic. And I only hope that it will be possible to engage people under the age of 25 in particular in current affairs, because they seem to have checked out. It's remarkable. But, you know, we are looking at a world which is awash with wonderful choices for them, you know, and constantly new choices. I mean, Disney Plus on its own, massive new choice for that demographic. Very, very interesting, very interested in Mandalorian, very interested in all this. That takes away from everything else. I mean, they're living in a dreamscape with $100 million movies landing every minute and 500 new series steering their way from the US. It's incredible that they're even remotely interested in anything but watching television. It's incredible. So let's count our lucky stars. Anyway.
Similar kind of area, well, a bit different, back to funding the BBC. Vincent Porter asks whether you have research that shows whether license fee payers actually understand what they're getting from the license fee. Because, of course, with top slicing, with S4C, everything, it's not just going to the BBC.
Yeah, yeah.
And Hugh asks, is there a case for purifying, quotes, the license fee by detaching some of those other issues?
Well, so far, what we've seen is the BBC becomes the home of all the great causes. And in some ways, I think that's a good thing, because these are so strongly understood as public service broadcasting interventions. S4C is a very good example. The Gaelic Channel is another, the World Service. So I think it's good for the BBC to be the home of all of these services. What would be nice is for the government not to just keep dumping, but also understand that all of these elements, and of course the underlying financial structure of the BBC, needs to be supported by an increase in the license fee. And to the point, I mean, what I don't understand is why the government doesn't see that people who do get so much value don't complain. So it's actually the absence of complaints. You know, they're never looking at the right side of the data, which is the millions and millions and millions of people who would be perfectly happy to pay more. What the government has failed to consider is that that would be the best value for the most number of people in this country, is to increase the license fee. An argument we have made many times. Because even if the BBC is...
An argument which the VLV makes as well.
Also. But you know, even if the BBC is wasteful, it doesn't... I mean, first of all, it has many, many constraints on being wasteful, no matter what people say about presenter salaries. But overall, we are all, and the world is getting more benefit from an increase in the license fee than anything else. In fact, if you look at these two big issues that we're looking at, Channel 4 privatization and the license fee, of the two, the license fee settlement is going to have infinitely more impact on independent production, on out-of-London strategies, on the number of bursaries that are given. That license fee settlement has enormous impact. The BBC remains the foundation of our creative ecology, of training, of the future of our industry, and you won't find anybody who will tell you contrary to that. So basically, the BBC and its income are more material to the quality of what people will have over the long term, and that remains the case. And I've been an analyst in this country for 40 years, almost 40 years, yeah. So that's an extraordinary statement to make. The BBC continues to be mission critical to the creative ecology of the UK.
Claire, we've been going for more than an hour. It's been fantastic. I could keep going probably for another hour, but we mustn't wear the patience of our audience too thin. Any final thoughts, any final comments?
Yeah, I'd like anyone who is still watching, I think I would like you to see the glass half full, not half empty. I think we're moving into a situation in which, with this legislation afoot, if we can all be positive and assistive to get these elements that are so important over the line before next election, and to have that piece of legislation establishing the future of public service media as envisaged by Ofcom, as envisaged by the DCMS, I think we should be all congratulating ourselves by the end of next year if we pull this off. So please, let us all work together for this much more positive and ambitious future, and get away from the terrible battles we've had in the last 18 months, some of which have been existential in nature. We're so far away from that existential moment, and I think we need to build, and to reimagine the future that British viewers and listeners want to be part of, and to do it now, together with Ofcom and the DCMS.
Thank you, Claire. That's been, I think, a brilliant session. Thank you for that. Thank you for everything you do for the industry, and the commentary that you give, the analysis and research that you produce. Thank you, too, for all the work I know you do in the charitable field, particularly with environmental and sociology channels. I think you've raised £30 million over 20 years. I don't know how you have the time to do it. But I'm really glad you had the time to come here tonight. And thank you, everybody else who's tuned into this session. We hope you've enjoyed it and found it as interesting as I have. If you're really as passionately interested in public service broadcasting and quality, universality, the kind of issues we've been talking about, one thing you can do is actually join the VLV. We're always extremely keen to have new members. Just go on our website, and it's very easy to sign up, and it costs very little money. So thank you, Claire. Thank you, everybody, again, and good evening.